Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's April 15, 2020, and today we're speaking with Mike Dunford, PhD candidate in Anthropology at the School of Culture, History and Languages, also at the Australian National University. Our topic for today is tea, but not just tea as a drink, rather pickled or fermented tea also as a snack, often consumed in Myanmar as a salad, lepeto. This humble, delicious dish is an excellent entry into learning about Myanmar's tea-growing regions and connections over time with other parts of Asia and the world. I'm sitting here in quarantine in an Australian hotel, and I'm eating a bowl of freshly diced tomato, fried beans, sesame seeds and peanuts tossed in oily fermented tea, which has been spiced so as to be chintse, or sour and spicy. Myanmar tea leaf salad is a unique dish unfamiliar to most of the world. So, Michael, could you please give us an overview of its place in Myanmar society, its consumption, preparation, and cultural significance?
Yeah, so historically, it's especially associated with royal weddings and with the royal justice system. When you attend a royal wedding as a guest, you're obliged to bring a tribute of lepet, of the pickled leaf comportion of the salad dish to give to the couple getting married. In the justice system, when two disagreeing parties have reached a settlement, they eat lepet together to signify that the dispute has been settled, or that they accept the judge's ruling, or that the conflict is over. It's still strongly associated with weddings in some contexts. I know in Pa'o culture in southern Shan State, the word for to get married is literally to eat lepet. But today it's a little bit more of a utility food. You can use it as a flavoring for rice. So in addition to the salad form that you just described, where you eat the leaves with fried beans and tomatoes and other dressings, at most sort of almost any restaurants in Myanmar, you can get rice mixed with crushed lepet. Lepetamim, so tea rice is what that's called. And there's another podcast out there actually by Professor Tarapita at NIU that goes into some of the connotations of that dish specifically, lepetamim. It's a little bit varied now. There's sort of this stereotype that it's kind of a formal food that's offered to guests when they arrive at houses, which definitely happens, but now it's also considered kind of a cram food, like a student food. When you eat it, it's a little bit like a slow release caffeine edible. So if you really need to stay up until all hours of the night, lepeto can enable you to do that quite easily. So during exam season, students will eat lepeto together to stay up. But it doesn't lose those connotations of community that are attached to it, even though students may not be thinking about that as they're eating it. Another major sort of role that it has now is just as sort of a condiment. Have you ever heard of shushe?
Oh, yeah, shushe.
Shushe, the price of shushe controls the price of lepeto across the tea market in Myanmar. So shushe is an onomatopoeia. It's supposed to be kind of mimic the sound that you make when you eat something that's like really chinsat, like shu shu she is like supposed to be that sound when you eat something that's too spicy. But basically, as a product, shushe is super pulverized lepet mixed with a bunch of other stuff, jackfruit paste and chili and garlic and salt, MSG, whatever. And they come in little plastic packets that almost look like the sauce packets that you would get at a fast food restaurant. So shushe is it's always 50 chat, no matter where you are in the country. Shuche always costs 50 cha. And I would guess that this is one of the most frequent ways that the fermented lepet leaves are consumed right now in 2020 is through Shuche, because you can kind of use it for anything. Like some of my friends will put it on potato chips. They'll mix it in with the little other fried snacks that you can get at corner stores. People will put it on rice. People use it almost as like a kind of hot sauce.
And how about its first preparation, its first use? In the records, when did people start fermenting tea in Myanmar and eating it?
Yeah, well, I definitely have hypotheses. I don't have a way to test them yet, I guess. But so definitely by the 16th century, fermenting lepet in this way, like producing a wet leaf that you eat as a snack, was super widespread by the 16th century, when the monastic order at that time wanted to popularize lepet as an alternative to alcoholic beverages. So when you're partying, you eat tea instead of drinking alcohol. And if you want to hear more about that, you can check out Vic Lieberman's book Strange Parallels discusses that, which is sort of this giant sprawling history of Myanmar. But so this event, when the kind of the Sangha at the time, the Buddhist order at the time, wanted to popularize this. So we know people were eating it already by the sort of the middle of the 16th century, and then this sort of religious-led popularization effort led to massive ecological changes in what is now northern Shan states, as huge tracts of land started to be used for tea cultivation, specifically for the purpose of this pickled, funky, oily snack. By the middle of the 16th century, most sort of Myanmar scholars of lepet who I've talked to have told me that if you go into the chronicles and these sort of old texts, you'll find evidence of it happening much earlier. But I haven't pursued that very much, only because it would be a pretty difficult task, and I've been focused on other things. But so if you ask, I think most people in Myanmar would guess that it's been happening since at least the Bagan period, so nearly 1,000 years.
When you sit at a friend's house in Myanmar and they serve you lepetto, where would each of the ingredients come from, and how have they been sorted or valued?
So the traditional dish for consuming lepetto is this thing called a yun o. Yun just means lacquerware, and o means cover, like lid. So it's sort of a covered lacquer dish with these divisions. There's kind of a circle in the middle and then little wedges surrounding the circle. So it kind of looks like a dartboard. Lepet goes in the middle of the dartboard, and around it you'll usually have, as you described, fried beans, sesame, garlic, sometimes tomatoes, chilies, all these different things. Oh, and usually tiny dried prawns as well. So tea, most of the tea that would go into tea leaf salad is from Shan State. I would say, close to 100% is from Shan State. The beans come from the dry zone primarily, but a little bit also from Shan. Sesame primarily from the dry zone, especially the northern part of the dry zone, so upper Mandalay, northern Magway, these places produce a lot of sesame. Chilies will come from all over the place, but I think the biggest producers right now are Southern Shan and Irrawaddy Division. I haven't very rigorously pursued that. That's just from asking people at markets where the chilies come from. But then the dried prawns come from mostly Irrawaddy and a little bit also Rakhine. Irrawaddy Division would be sort of the major one. So you can kind of imagine this map in your head. When you're eating this thing, you're eating ingredients that come from tall mountains in Shan State for the tea leaves, right across the dry zone for the beans and the sesame, the garlic, maybe also the chilies, and then the coastal regions in terms of the dried prawns. And there'll usually be some sort of fish paste used in preparing the tea leaves, I would say in most cases. So in a sense, when you're eating a plate of this stuff, you're sort of eating the whole country at once. As for the tea leaves themselves, the leaves that go in tea leaf salad don't need to be the highest quality. There are a bunch of traditional rules for cultivation and harvest of the dried leaves, the pechao, for drinking, and especially chochao, the leaves that get made into kind of the tea shop tea that you talked about with Dinith last month. So dried tea is generally made from leaves that are right at the tips of the branches. Some people call it a bud. It's not really a bud in the sense of a flower, but it's sort of the terminal youngest leaf and the two leaves next to it. That's really the only part of the plant that people will use for producing dried tea, unless they're making really cheap, low-grade stuff and kind of trying to pinch money out of the plant. But so for lepeso, the pickled tea, you can make that from much rougher leaves, which would mean further down the branch of the tea plant. So older leaves, bigger leaves, these can be pickled. You can make pickled tea from these the tips from the sort of terminal end of the branch, the youngest leaves, but that stuff is expensive. You know, when you're eating tea leaf salad, if the leaves are whole, if what you're looking at are complete leaves on the plate, like you can identify there's clearly a stem and a leaf with a tip on it, that tends to be higher. That tends to indicate that you're eating rather, higher quality stuff. If you get lepet and it's kind of a paste, as you can imagine, the paste can be adulterated with all sorts of other things. And people have their pet theories, like, oh, I don't buy the ground lepet from that place because they doctor it with tamarind leaves and all sorts of other adulterations, but I think most shops wouldn't do that because they would lose customers. But basically, if you're looking at the ground stuff, that can be made from much lower quality, rougher leaves than the whole leaf stuff. Once the leaves are harvested, if you want to produce the wet stuff, you'll steam them or kind of dry fry them briefly and then basically pack them into a bag, which you leave in a cool space. So some people put it underground, some people put it under their houses, and that sits and ferments for about 3 months at a minimum, but you could leave it for as long as a year. Most of when you see the flavorings, so sweet or hot and sour or ginger flavored, most of those flavorings, those would be done by kind of mid-level brokers, I would say. So the tea farmer will sell sort of unflavored pickled leaves to a broker who will have some sort of factory or mid-level operation where they'll process the leaves by cutting them with chili, garlic, different types of oil, different types of fish pastes, whatever it is. And then they'll sell bulk flavored stuff onwards. Obviously, there are a bunch of different things that can happen in the middle, but usually the people who are pickling the tea and harvesting the tea are not the ones who are flavoring it. That's something that happens later, once the leaves reach, Mandalay or Yangon or elsewhere. From time to harvest to when you're eating it, the fastest possible time that would take could be probably something like 4 months. I don't know for sure. But it could be, well over that. Maybe, let's say, 6 months up to maybe a year.
Where is tea grown in Myanmar, and how do these growing regions differ in ecology, culture, markets, and demographics? You've mentioned Shan State, but what about Sagaing region?
Shan State is where the bulk of commercially produced tea comes from. So that's let's say, tea produced for markets that the farmers themselves may never go to. In Sagaing, that stuff is mostly produced for a local market. So the funny thing about tea ecology is they don't just differ from region to region, but they differ vastly within regions. So for tea to taste good, you kind of want it to be around this sweet spot of altitude that's, like, speaking very roughly, like 1,500 to 2,000 meters approximately is the sweet spot where you're producing really good tea. And there are a lot of places in Myanmar that fit that criteria. It's a pretty bumpy, hilly country. But even within Shan State, you'll get mountains where the west side of the mountain is super wet and rainforesty. The east side of the mountain is super dry. And so tea kind of gets cultivated in the middle. So on the, for example, north face or south face of the mountain, depending on how winds are in that particular region. And so this means that within Shan State, there are certain, even particular mountains and particular villages where if you are in the tea industry in Myanmar, or you're a little bit more picky than the average consumer, you might know some of these places. So the most famous one is Gwanhe Mountain, which is sort of between Namsan and Chautme. Another famous village is Daunjo. So these are places where the growing conditions are really perfect for creating high quality tea. In general, the bulk of tea comes from, if you could imagine sort of the main road that goes from Mandalay out to Lasho, if you could imagine that road as kind of the bottom, the border of Shan State and Mandalay region is kind of the left side or the west side, and the Chinese border as the top. That's sort of a triangle. That sort of triangular area is really the heartland of tea production in Myanmar. The problem, though, is a lot of that area is in the midst of a conflict right now. A really messy multilateral conflict between several ethnic armed organizations who are fighting against one another and against the Damodar, the Myanmar military. And what that means is it's harder to import labor during peak harvest times, and it's also harder to move around the area because you have sort of checkpoints everywhere. Roads are considered to be kind of dangerous. So this is driving a boom in southern Shan State. Southern Shan State, most people will tell you the tea's not as good, but there are places that are producing good tea in southern Shan State, as kind of some of the more famous producers in the north are trying to find ways to enter the market in the south. They're looking for places in southern Shan State where they can kind of replicate the good tea growing conditions that they're accustomed to in the north. This is mostly happening in, I would say, 4 places in southern Shan State, which are Yunnan, Bindia, Gallaw, and Binlaung. Binlaung is the biggest region of tea production in southern Shan State. Yunnan and Bindia are the fastest growing. A lot of the tea that you find in Yangon these days is from the south, would be from one of these places. You'll still find tea from northern Shan State, and the bulk of stuff that you would buy in, say, like City Mart or at the really big agricultural markets in Yangon, like Nyampinle, that would come from northern Shan State still, because those supply lines do still exist. But when you find smaller producers, smaller vendors selling stuff that's maybe from a family tea farm or from a friend's tea farm, a lot of these new farms are in the south. So you'd mentioned Sagaing. So there definitely is tea being grown in Sagaing, especially in far northern Sagaing. So around like Tamanti, Homelin, like up near the Naga region. And tea has a really long history of being cultivated up there. In the late 19th century, when the British colonials were surveying that area, they encountered tea cultivation up there. So it's been going on for a pretty long time. It was already an old cultivation site in the 1890s. You'll also find tea being grown in Kachin State, mostly for local markets, and in Kayin State as well. You'll find it. There's a big famous tea factory in Tendaunji, kind of near to Taungu. And that's a military-owned operation that mostly produces black tea. I don't think they produce any pickled tea at all. So Shan State's the epicenter, but you can kind of find it all over the country.
Does the domestication of tea in Myanmar mirror other major tea-producing countries such as China and India, both of which border contemporary Myanmar, or does it differ in key ways? Does tea know boundaries?
If you look at the literature on the domestication of tea, you get this weird impression that it sort of only took place within the borders of what is now China, and to a lesser extent and later, and because of the British, in India. And you get these funny maps that sort of show tea domestication processes happening right up to the border of Myanmar, but not across it, which is, to me, absurd. Clearly, tea has been cultivated in Myanmar for a super long time. The tea plant, which is a variety of camellia, like all plants, does not care about international borders. The borders with Myanmar and China and Myanmar and India, as we know them now, have only really existed as bright lines on the map since, World War II, maybe. So how did tea domestication happen? Is the history in Myanmar different? Well, what I would suggest is something like this. If you look at a map of the southern Himalayan region, I would guess that tea cultivation, tea consumption, tea domestication is part of a very, very long history of trade and migration that spreads from what is now southwest China across sort of the northern Himalayan, the northern Southeast Asia or the southern Himalayan foothills all the way into India. I think there's a lot of nationalist baggage attached to domestication discourses. Like, it can be a point of national pride if you say, we domesticated the tea plant. But to think of domestication processes as something that are relevant to the national borders that we see now, to me, it doesn't make any sense. I think we need to take a much longer perspective, take a perspective that doesn't view borders as these sort of rigid things. So, was tea domesticated in what is now Myanmar? I think yes, but a little bit depends on what you mean by domestication. I think people in what is now Myanmar, in what is now Northern Shan State, Kachin State, have probably been experimenting with Camellia sinensis and its near relatives for millennia, as they have in India, as they have in China. I think the role of the British in spreading this plant around the southern Himalayan region has been massively overblown, and we need to look at pre-colonial trade and migration networks to really understand how this plant spread around what is now Southwest China, Southeast Asia, and India, especially Northeast India.
So perhaps a more appropriate lens to look at the domestication of tea would be Zomia, or the Southeast Asian Massif extended.
The Southeast Asian Massif sort of writ large, so including Northeast India and including, a significant chunk of China, that's where tea comes from.
You're also interested in the ethnic dimensions of tea in Myanmar, and the Da'ang in particular. So let's go back to talking about who are the Da'ang, and what do you mean when you say that they mobilize different identities in their tea lives?
So the name Da'ang, as with any sort of ethnonym in Myanmar or many other places, it's sort of it's contested, right? Like, what does Da'ang mean? It depends on who you ask. If you ask someone who's not attuned to the ethnic politics of Northern Shan State, like even a Burmese person, they might say, like, Da'ang, who are they? Oh, you mean Balaung? But then in China, the groups who speak related languages to Da'ang people in Myanmar, they are called Da'ang by the Chinese state, which is obviously, the same word in a different dialect. But then who gets to be Da'ang? Well, it depends on who you ask. Da'ang people definitely mobilize different identities depending on the situation that they are in. But that's not something that only Da'ang people do. That's something that everybody does. But in the particular context of Da'ang people, and especially Da'ang tea producers, a lot of that identity revolves around tea and revolves around the tea industry. So many of the Da'ang people who I've met, they might differ in terms of their clan affiliation or the particular language that they speak at home. They might differ from one another. But the thing that really binds them together as Da'ang people is this really kind of nuanced knowledge of how tea works in Myanmar, in terms of how the ecologies work, how the market works, and whether they kind of portray themselves as a businessman, kind of no different from other Myanmar people, or as a Daang person or as a member of their clan. They can mobilize all of those things depending on the context they are in. But the thing that I think, not the only thing, but one of the most important things that my Daang friends would say makes them Daang, regardless of the internal variation within the Daang community, is this deep knowledge of and long association with tea and with the tea industry.
Now, Mike, we're coming up on the end of the show. So I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to share or anything you've learned doing this project so far before I ask about recommendations.
One thing that I've learned doing this project is that when you ask people to talk about food, you learn an unbelievable amount about them. Thinking of myself, more as an economic anthropologist of Myanmar than an anthropologist of food, but now I realize that the conversations that I have with people that are most interesting are just asking them to tell me about what do they like about tea leaf salad? Where does the best stuff come from? How do they like to eat it? How do they prepare it? Who do they eat it with? If you want to learn about Myanmar, there's no better way into it than learning about Burmese food, talking to people about it, learning to prepare it yourself. That's been sort of maybe one of the most productive parts of this project for me.
Now we've come to the end, Mike. Could you please give a recommendation to our listeners? It can be anything to do with Myanmar or perhaps tea. Just something that you'd like our listeners to go and check out if they're interested.
I would say if you're interested in tea and you want to read more about tea, or hear more about tea, there are a few people I would check out. So one is an anthropologist called Professor Sarah Beske. She writes on the tea industry in India, particularly on Darjeeling, but she's got a new book coming out about sort of the global black tea industry, which is different to what I do, but should be an awesome book. So Sarah Beske's great. And then on the other side of Myanmar, in Yunnan, there are a few people worth checking out whose work is really, really good. So one of those is Selena Ahmed, Professor Selena Ahmed, and then another guy called Po Yi Hung, Professor Po Yi Hung. So Selena Ahmed is an ethnobotanist. So if you're interested in the ecology of these things, her work is really excellent. Po Yi Hung is more of a geographer, so if you're interested in sort of the politics of tea in China, he's great. And then finally, look up a Myanmar grocery store near you if you're not in Myanmar. There are some great ones in Australia and in the US as well, who will send you pickled tea and fried beans, which if you're making it at home, make sure to, as Luke, as you described in the beginning, definitely put some tomatoes in there, and you will definitely need fresh garlic and fresh chilies. To me, these are absolutely necessary for the maximum delicious consumption of lepet dope. And finally, this is kind of a secret. Traditionally, lepet dope would be consumed with green tea. So, dried green tea, you brew it, you eat the tea, and you're drinking it at the same time. That's the traditional way, and that is absolutely delicious. However, the secret that everybody knows but few people talk about is lepetto tea leaf salad is one of the world's great beer snacks. So if you are stuck inside and you want to have a small culinary adventure with your 5 p.m. beer, strongly recommend lepetto as an accompaniment to it.
Thanks for being on Myanmar Musings, Mike.
Pleasure to be here.